The alarm on Nora Ellsworth's phone went off at 4:53 in the morning, the same as it did every single day. She didn't slam it off or groan into her pillow. She simply opened her eyes in the gray pre-dawn darkness of her Philadelphia apartment, stared at the water stains spreading across the ceiling above her bedroom, and lay still for exactly 30 seconds before swinging her feet under the cold hardwood floor. That was the ritual. 30 seconds. No more. She had learned early in the 3 years since the divorce that if she allowed herself longer, the weight of everything would settle onto her chest and make getting up feel like a physical impossibility. The apartment was on the second floor of a narrow brick building on Callow Hill Street, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a check cashing place. The radiator in the corner worked about 60% of the time. The window in the kitchen looked directly into the brick wall of the building next door. The bathroom faucet dripped with a rhythmic persistence that she had long since stopped hearing. She had moved here directly from the lawyer's office 3 years ago after the settlement was finalized. After Clifford Hargrove's team of attorneys, 7 of them, all from firms with marble lobbies and partners who billed at rates that would have made Nora's father weep, had systematically dismantled every argument her single overworked lawyer had attempted to construct. After the prenuptial agreement she had signed at 28 in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, because Clifford had slid it across the table and said it was just a formality, had turned out to be a 17-page financial tourniquet that cut off every artery of her claim to the empire she had helped build. She had walked out of that settlement with enough money to last 14 months if she was careful. She had not been careful. A surgery, nothing dramatic, just a routine procedure that had turned complicated in the way that medical things do when you are suddenly uninsured, had consumed the majority of it in a single invoice. She had been at the bakery on Fairmount Avenue for 2 years and 4 months. She knew the hours, knew the smell of the place so deeply it had become indistinguishable from her own skin. She knew which rack in the back oven ran hot on the left side. She knew that the morning rush peaked at 7:40 and died by 8:15. She knew that her feet would hurt by noon, and that by the end of a double shift, they would hurt in a way that was no longer fully describable as pain, but had become something more like a constant background condition, like weather. She put on her uniform in the dark, drank a cup of instant coffee standing at the kitchen counter, and picked up the stack of past due bills. She didn't open them. She just shuffled through them with the mechanical familiarity of someone who had memorized the numbers already. Electric, gas, the credit card she had opened after the surgery, the second credit card she had opened to make the minimum payments on the first one. She set them back down, finished her coffee, and went to work. That was the life of Nora Ellsworth at 51 years old. That was what remained after 20 years. But once a long time ago, there had been something else entirely. In 1998, Clifford Hargrove was 31 years old and owned almost nothing. He had a second-hand desk in a rented office on the third floor of a building in Center City, Philadelphia, that smelled permanently of cigarette smoke and old carpet. He had a telephone, a fax machine, and an idea about commercial real estate development in neighborhoods that the rest of the city had written off as hopeless. He also had Nora. She was 28. She had a degree in accounting from Temple University and a mind that could hold the architecture of a complex financial problem the way other people held melodies effortlessly, completely, without needing to write it down. She had believed in Clifford's idea before Clifford himself fully believed in it. On the night of February 11th, 1998, Nora sat at the second-hand desk in that rented office at 2 o'clock in the morning while Clifford slept on the narrow couch against the wall. She had been there since 6 the previous evening. She had a calculator, 3 legal pads covered in her small, precise handwriting, and a pot of gas station coffee that had long since gone cold. In the morning, Clifford had a meeting with a regional bank's commercial lending officer. The proposal he was going to walk in with was the proposal Nora had been constructing in the dark. The financial projections, the risk analysis, the debt structuring that made the numbers work. The language that transformed a risky bet on a struggling neighborhood to something that looked on paper like inevitability. She had done this while he slept. She had done this because she believed in it, in the idea that two people with nothing but intelligence and work and absolute commitment to each other could build something real. He got the loan. That meeting was the first domino. Within 3 years, Hargrove Capital had completed 4 development projects in Philadelphia and was moving into New York. Within 7 years, Clifford Hargrove was the kind of man whose name appeared in the business section of major newspapers. Within 12 years, he was the kind of man who owned the newspapers. Through all of it, Nora was beside him. Not in the boardroom, Clifford had discouraged that, and she had allowed it because she had believed in those early years that it was a practical division of labor rather than what it actually was. She managed the household that made his relentless schedule possible. She hosted the dinners where deals were softened and relationships were built. She was the person who remembered the names of his investors' wives and their children's ages, and their preferences, who made the people who mattered to Clifford's empire feel like they mattered as people. She had given the best years of her professional mind to a man in a company that bore his name alone. And then at 48, she had come home on a Thursday afternoon to find Clifford sitting in the living room of their Greenwich house with an expression she recognized not as guilt, but as the particular executive decisiveness he brought to the closing of transactions he had already decided on. He wanted a divorce. He had already retained counsel. The woman he intended to marry was 34 years old. Her name was Selena. She was exactly the kind of beautiful that made people in rooms stop talking. Nora had not cried in front of him. She had sat in the chair across from him and listened and asked 3 questions and received answers and then stood up and walked out of the room. But that was 3 years ago, and Nora Ellsworth had not cried since. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October while she was restocking the pastry display case and trying to ignore the fact that her left knee had begun to emit a grinding sensation she was choosing not to investigate. She almost didn't answer. The number was a Manhattan area code she didn't recognize, and Manhattan phone numbers almost never meant anything good for a woman in her circumstances. She answered on the 4th ring. "Miss Ellsworth?" The voice was measured and precise with the cadence of a man who spent his professional life delivering information he was not personally responsible for. "My name is Theodore Bancroft. I'm a senior partner at Bancroft and Whitmore in Manhattan. I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Clifford Hargrove." The noise of the bakery continued around her, the espresso machine, a customer asking about the almond croissants, the bell above the door. "He's dead," Nora said. It wasn't a question. A brief pause. "Mr. Hargrove passed away yesterday morning. A cardiac event on the Weathersfield Country Club course in Connecticut. I'm sorry for your loss." Nora said nothing. "I'm calling to request your presence at the formal reading of Mr. Hargrove's will. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. Our office is at 590 Madison Avenue." "Why would I be present at a reading of Clifford's will?" Another pause, this one slightly different in character, as if Bancroft was measuring something. "Your name appears in the document, Ms. Ellsworth. I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics over the phone. I want to be direct with you. I would encourage you not to form any particular expectations, but your presence is requested." She looked at the pastry case, at the perfectly arranged rows of croissants in Danish and the little individual cheesecakes she had learned to make because the morning crowd seemed to want them. "Thursday at 10, she said. She hung up and stood for a moment with her hand still on the phone. She did not form any particular expectations. She had used up her particular expectations 3 years ago. Clifford Hargrove was dead at 62 on a golf course in Connecticut, and the only thing Nora felt was the profound and slightly disorienting sensation of a door she had not known was still ajar, finally clicking closed. She took Wednesday off and ironed her navy suit. It was the only good suit she still owned, a remnant from the other life, slightly dated in its cut, but still holding its shape because it had been well made when she bought it back. When well-made things were simply a category of purchase, she moved through without thought. She arrived at 590 Madison Avenue at 9:45 on Thursday morning, took the elevator to the 23rd floor, and gave her name to a receptionist who led her down a corridor lined with the kind of art that existed not to be looked at, but to communicate without words the magnitude of the fees charged within these walls. Theodore Bancroft was a trim man in his late 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and the immaculately neutral expression of a federal judge. He stood behind a desk the size of a small boat and nodded at Nora as she entered. Selena Voss was on the leather sofa to the left. She was exactly as beautiful as Nora had expected. The black dress was Chanel. Nora recognized the cut the way a carpenter recognizes a specific grade of wood, and it fit her with the seamless precision of something made for a body rather than a size. Her dark hair was immaculate. Her nails were perfect. Her eyes were completely dry. She looked at Nora the way a person looks at something that has appeared in their peripheral vision and been assessed as non-threatening in a single glance. A brief practiced smile that contained within it, like a small stone inside a piece of fruit, the absolute certainty of her own position in this room. Nora sat down in the chair across from the desk, set her worn leather handbag on her knee, and folded her hands. Bancroft cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and unsealed the embossed envelope that had been sitting precisely centered on his desk. What followed was a procession that lasted nearly 40 minutes. Charitable donations, first a roster of foundations and institutions designed to extend Clifford's public legacy. Then the real assets, the Greenwich estate, the house where Nora had spent 11 years of her life transferred in full to Selena Voss, the Manhattan penthouse, the Vale property, the collection of vehicles, the stock portfolios, the municipal bonds, the investment accounts Nora had watched accumulate across 2 decades of careful decisions, many of which had originated in her own mind. All of it went to Selena. Selena shifted slightly on the sofa with each announcement, a barely perceptible realignment, like a person settling more comfortably into a chair that had been designed for them. The gleam in her eyes was real and entirely unconcealed. And then Bancroft turned to the final page. His voice shifted almost imperceptibly, but Nora caught it. A slight drop in register. A pause a half beat longer than the others. And finally, he said, "To my former wife, Nora Ellsworth." The room tightened. Bancroft read directly from the page, his voice returning to its precise professional flatness, which somehow made every word land harder. To Nora, who always claimed she never cared about my money and only wanted my heart, I leave the sum of $1. May it reflect the true value of her loyalty to me. And the silence that came after was total. Selena made a sound, small, soft, emerging from behind the hand she raised to her lips. Not laughter, not technically. Something between that and a gasp existing in the specific register of a person watching an opponent receive a humiliation so perfectly calibrated, it briefly transcends cruelty and becomes almost artistic. Bancroft reached into the brass pocket of his jacket, produced a single dollar bill. New crisp, unfolded, and placed it on the desk. He looked at his legal pad. He did not look at Nora. Nora looked at the dollar bill. The paper was so new it seemed to still carry something of the mint in it. She looked at it for what was probably only 4 or 5 seconds, but felt considerably longer to everyone in the room. And then something happened that no one in that room had planned for. Nora Ellsworth smiled, not a polite smile, not the brittle defensive smile of a person absorbing a blow. A real smile starting at the corners of her mouth and reaching her eyes with the speed and involuntary quality of a genuine reaction. The smile broke open into a soft, genuine laugh. Then the laugh grew. It filled the room, bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows and the polished wood paneling entirely wrong for the context in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. It was the laughter of a person who has just understood a joke that had been told a long time ago. Selena's expression curdled immediately. The smugness deformed, replaced by something that mixed irritation and confusion in equal measure. "Is something amusing to you?" Selena's voice was sharp. Nora's laughter quieted. She stood smoothing her navy jacket with both hands. She reached forward and picked up the single dollar bill. folded it once along its length, and slid it into the interior pocket of her handbag with the same care she would have used for something valuable. "No, Selena," she said. Her voice was steady and entirely without performance. "It's just that Clifford spent his entire life terrified that people only wanted him for his money. And even from the grave, he couldn't stop trying to buy the last word." She looked directly at the younger woman for one long, unhurried moment. "You can keep the estate. I have exactly what I came for. Proof that I survived him." She turned and walked to the door. "Thank you, Theodore," she said without turning back. She walked out and left the mahogany door open behind her. The subway ride home took 42 minutes. She found a seat near the window and watched the city move past the underground dark of the tunnel, giving way at intervals to the gray October light of the elevated sections, the brick faces of buildings, the water towers, the ordinary machinery of a city engaged in its own continuous business without any reference to her. She felt lighter than she had in years. Not happy, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but lighter. As though something she had been carrying for 3 years without fully registering its weight had simply been set down on the floor of that conference room, and she had walked out without it. Back in the apartment, she went to the bedroom closet and pulled a shoebox from the shelf, an old box dusty at the edges that she had carried from apartment to apartment without ever intending to open. She took it to the kitchen table and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, a few pieces of jewelry she no longer wore, a birthday card in her mother's handwriting, and at the very bottom a photograph from 1998, two young people standing outside a narrow doorway on the third floor of a building in Center City, Philadelphia. The sign beside the door read, "Hargrove Capital Suite 304. On the left, Nora at 28, her left hand holding a thick stack of folders against her chest. On the right, Clifford at 31, pen extended mid-signature. On a lease agreement, his head half turned toward her, laughing at something she had been saying. They looked young. They looked genuinely happy. She opened her wallet and took out the dollar bill. She folded it precisely and placed it in the bottom of the shoebox next to the photograph. Then she put the lid back on, stood up and went to bed. She did not know, she could not have known, lying in the dark of her second-floor apartment, that the dollar bill she had placed in that shoebox was not an insult at all. It was a key, and the door it opened was larger than anything Clifford Hargrove had ever built with his name on it. The knock came at 6 o'clock the following morning. 3 solid, deliberate strikes against the wood, the knock of a person who had driven through the pre-dawn dark with a specific destination and a specific purpose and intended to be heard. Nora was already awake somewhere between sleep and full consciousness when the sound pulled her the rest of the way into the morning. Through the peephole, standing in the dim hallway, looking considerably less composed than he had in the conference room less than 24 hours earlier, was Theodore Bancroft. He was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat, slightly damp at the shoulders. The silver-rimmed glasses were the same, but the expression behind them was entirely different from the calibrated neutrality she had observed yesterday. This was the face of a man managing urgency and not entirely succeeding. She unlocked both deadbolts and opened the door. "I need you to let me in," he said. "I apologize for the hour. I would not be here if it were not absolutely necessary." She studied him for a moment. 23 years of watching Clifford conduct business had given her a precise instrument for reading men in expensive coats who arrived with urgent information. This man was not performing urgency. He was containing it. She opened the door wider. He stepped inside and took in the apartment, the water stains, the bills on the kitchen table, the mismatched furniture with practiced impassivity. He set his leather portfolio on the kitchen table and turned to face her. "You need to call your employer," he said. "Tell them you have a family emergency. Then I need you to pack an overnight bag. My car is waiting downstairs." "I'm not in the habit of taking instructions from lawyers I met yesterday," Nora said, arms folded. "I have bread to bake." "The dollar bill," Bancroft said. "The one you picked up in my office yesterday morning. What about it?" "It was not an insult. It was a legal instrument." By accepting it voluntarily in the presence of a licensed attorney and a notary public who was seated in that room, you executed the activation clause of a secondary legal structure that does not appear anywhere in the public document I read yesterday. He held her gaze. A structure that Selena Voss knows absolutely nothing about. The kitchen was very quiet. The faucet dripped. Nora unfolded her arms. Clifford spent 14 months building what I'm about to show you, Bancroft continued. He asked me to give you the choice of walking away from it, but he believed you would not walk away. Nora stood in the center of her kitchen in her bathrobe next to the stack of bills and the dripping faucet, and looked at the lawyer who had yesterday handed her a single-dollar bill as the sum total of 20 years. She picked up her phone and called the bakery. They left Philadelphia at 6:45 in a black sedan with tinted windows and the hushed quality of a vehicle built for people who paid to not be aware of the road beneath them. Bancroft sat across from her and for the first stretch of the drive said almost nothing, seeming to understand that she needed the silence to think. They moved north through the gray October morning out of the city and into the flat landscape of the New Jersey Turnpike, then west again across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The terrain changed as they drove highway, giving way to smaller roads, towns thinning into farmland, and then into rolling hills dense with oak and hickory, carrying the last of their fall color. The GPS on the driver's console went dark somewhere in Chester County. Nora watched it happen, their position visible on screen, and then as they turned onto an unmarked road, simply a blue dot suspended in empty gray space with no road visible beneath it. Clifford had the surrounding area excluded from commercial mapping data, Bancroft said. He had the means to arrange it and the reasons to want it. They drove another 12 minutes on a packed gravel road flanked by oak trees that had been growing for 100 years. And then around a curve, a set of iron gates appeared perhaps 14 feet high, set into stone pillars, opening without any visible human intervention as the car slowed to approach. Beyond them, a driveway of pale white gravel stretched ahead through a corridor of mature trees. At the end of the driveway, Hargrove Estate revealed itself gradually, the way something large always does, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece requiring adjustment before the next could be absorbed. Pennsylvania fieldstone, 3 stories, a slate roof, window frames painted a deep forest green, weathered to exactly the right shade of permanence. Ivy on the eastern wing, controlled and deliberate. 200 acres of ground surrounding it, with a formal garden on the south side, a private lake visible through the trees to the east, and dense mixed forests pressing in on the north and west like a kept promise of privacy. Standing in a line inside the entrance hall, high ceilings, a mahogany staircase, a chandelier that was old rather than decorative, was the staff. 7 people standing quietly looking at Nora with the attentiveness of people who had been told something important was arriving and were now confirming that it had. At the head of the line stood a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and straight-backed, with the kind of steady, unhurried presence that comes only from years of managing complex households without anyone noticing the management. "Welcome to Hargrove Estate, Ms. Ellsworth," Mrs. Winthrop said. Not as a courtesy, as a statement of fact. They sat in the library floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a fireplace on the 4th, 2 leather chairs angled toward each other across a low table, and a bay window looking out over the private lake, its surface moving in the slow, barely perceptible way of deep water and light wind. On the mahogany desk near the window, a small silver frame had been placed precisely in the center. Inside it, a single-dollar bill, new crisp. Nora noticed it but said nothing yet. Bancroft opened his portfolio. 14 months before his death, he began. Clifford discovered an irregularity in a subsidiary account, a small one, the kind that most people would attribute to accounting error and move past. Clifford did not move past it. He laid documents on the table, balance sheets, highlighted figures. He retained Aegis Consulting, a private intelligence firm based in Washington, former FBI, former Treasury Department. They are expensive and they do not make mistakes. Bancroft's voice remained level. Over the following 4 months, Aegis conducted a comprehensive investigation into the financial activities surrounding Hargrove Capital and into the personal conduct of Selena Voss. He produced more documents. What they found was not a small irregularity. Selena Voss had been conducting an affair with Preston Caldwell for approximately 2 years. Caldwell, 58 years old, founder of Caldwell Development Group, was the man who had been Clifford's single most persistent obstacle for the better part of a decade. They had competed on opposite sides of major commercial development bids across New York and Boston. They had sued each other twice. By all public accounts, their contempt was mutual and genuine. What Aegis had discovered was that this contempt was on Caldwell's side entirely strategic. Selena had been passing him information, not casually, systematically. Photographs of sealed bid documents, internal financial projections, proprietary market analyses that Hargrove Capital's team spent months developing. Caldwell had used this intelligence to undercut Clifford on 7 major contracts over 18 months. The total value of the business lost to a man who was cheating with information that came from inside Clifford's own house was Aegis calculated somewhere north of $40 million. The final phase of the plan, documented in intercepted communications, was this. Selena would transfer $50 million in liquid assets to an offshore account registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Then she would file for divorce, claiming emotional abuse, and use the resulting proceedings to claim the remaining visible assets. Caldwell would acquire certain of those assets through proxies at favorable valuations. They would split the proceeds. Clifford would have been left with nothing. Nora sat with all of this for a long moment. He knew everything, she said, and he stayed. He stayed because leaving would have triggered her plan prematurely. She would have moved the money before he could secure it. He needed time to build the counterstructure. Bancroft folded his hands. The Vanguard Fiduciary Trust took 6 months to construct properly. It required 11 separate legal entities across 4 jurisdictions. Every real asset, the liquid capital, the clean investments this estate was moved into the trust through a structure that left no visible trail in any domestic filing. What remained in Clifford's name was the surface. He gave her exactly what she was planning to take, Nora said. He just made sure it was worthless before she got her hands on it. Each major asset was encumbered over a period of 8 months. Mortgages taken against fully paid properties and immediately transferred to secondary creditors. Margin loans against the stock portfolios at levels that make them functionally insolvent the moment the market moves in any ordinary direction. The Greenwich estate has a mortgage of approximately $4 million more than it is worth in the current market. The creditors are real, the obligations are legal, and they will begin enforcing them within the next 2 weeks. Bancroft paused. She has no idea. The encumbrances were filed in jurisdictions and under entity structures that her attorneys have not yet identified. Nora looked at the bay window. The lake was steel gray in the October morning. A single heron stood at the near edge, absolutely still, watching the water. "And Caldwell," she said, "where is he now?" "Geneva." A dry quality entered Bancroft's voice. He flew out 48 hours before Clifford's death was made public. He had received legal counsel advising him of exposure risk once the estate mechanics activated, and he moved accordingly. He has issued a public statement from his New York office categorically denying any personal relationship with Selena Voss. His attorneys in Zurich filed preemptive documentation with federal authorities the following morning. He left her, completely, and without sentiment. The words settled in the room. Preston Caldwell, the man Selena had fed information to for 2 years, the man for whom she had dismantled a marriage, had watched the situation become dangerous and departed for Switzerland without a phone call. He had cut her loose with the clean efficiency of a person who had always known, in the part of themselves they don't examine closely, that the arrangement was temporary. Selena Voss was alone. She was facing the collapse of every financial structure she had believed she owned. And she didn't know yet that the woman she had dismissed in a lawyer's office the previous morning was sitting in a leather chair in a house that didn't exist on any map holding all the remaining cards. Bancroft reached into the portfolio one final time and placed a thick red folder on the table. "This is the Aegis dossier," he said, "complete, high-resolution photographs, decrypted communications, offshore banking transaction records traceable through 3 layers of shell companies, and the chemical analysis." Nora looked at the folder without touching it. The chemical analysis. Bancroft removed his glasses and cleaned them with a small cloth with the deliberate slowness of a man deciding how to say something. In the final pages of his journal, which I'll give you shortly, Clifford documented that Aegis had discovered a substance in Selena's private vanity in the Greenwich house, a synthetic compound, no prescription name, not commercially available through any domestic pharmacy. He replaced his glasses. It was designed to elevate blood pressure and impose progressive cardiovascular stress over time. Taken in small amounts at intervals over months, it produces effects indistinguishable from the natural deterioration of a 62-year-old man with a history of high-stress living. The room was very still. The coroner ruled it cardiac arrest secondary to chronic stress and age-related cardiovascular disease. Bancroft continued, "There was no toxicology screening for synthetic compounds of this class. There would have been no reason to order one." "Clifford knew," Nora said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "He knew for approximately 4 months before his death. He documented it in the journal. He chose not to report it to law enforcement. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing closely, that a federal investigation would take years, would become public, would center his legacy on a criminal proceeding rather than on what he had built, and would result in a prison sentence of perhaps 8 to 12 years. Bancroft looked at her directly. "He wrote that this was insufficient. He wanted something she could not appeal, could not negotiate, and could not recover from." He slid the red folder toward her. "This dossier contains sufficient evidence to support federal indictments for corporate espionage, financial fraud, and attempted homicide for both Selena Voss and Preston Caldwell, though Caldwell's exposure on the homicide charge is limited given his legal preparation." He folded his hands. "Clifford left the decision to you. You are the sole trustee of the Vanguard Trust. You control this estate and the assets within it, and you are the only person other than myself who knows this folder exists." He produced the brown leather journal and set it beside the folder. "Read this first," he said quietly. "I'll be down the hall." The journal took 4 hours. Nora sat at the mahogany desk while the October morning became afternoon, the light shifting across the surface of the lake outside the bay window as the hours moved. Mrs. Winthrop brought tea at some point and set it beside her without speaking and left. The journal was college-ruled, the kind available at any office supply store. Clifford had always been like that, capable of extraordinary financial complexity and entirely indifferent to aesthetic trappings. The pen used throughout was a basic ballpoint. The handwriting was his, the sharp, compressed letters she had watched sign thousands of documents over 20 years. She read every page. The early entries were precise and controlled, written in the careful hand of a man documenting what he observed without yet allowing himself to feel its full weight. The account irregularities, the decision to call Aegis, the first preliminary report, the names appearing in proximity to each other for the first time in the measured clinical language Clifford used to record his response. As the months progressed, the handwriting changed. Not dramatically, Clifford was not capable of falling apart or had trained himself out of it long ago, but in small ways she recognized. The letters pressed harder into the page. Sentences that had been long and structured became shorter, more compressed, as though he was writing faster, not because he was less careful, but because the effort of containing everything within controlled language was increasing with each new piece of information Aegis delivered. The entry about the substance in the vanity was written at 2:15 in the morning. The handwriting on that page was pressed so hard that in certain places the pen had nearly broken through. He had written 3 sentences and crossed them out. The crossing out was not careful. It was the only place in the entire journal where she could see plainly something he had needed to put down and then decided he could not afford to leave visible. What he had written instead and not crossed out was this: I know what she is doing. I know what she has been doing for months. I have known since the Aegis report in August, and I have continued to live in the same house and eat the same dinners, and I have not said a word because the structure is not yet complete. I am not afraid. I want to be clear about that. What I feel is not fear. What I feel is something I do not have a word for, which is unusual for me. I have built everything in my life on my ability to find the right word for every situation. I do not have one for this. She sat with that paragraph for a long time. The final entry was 2 pages written 3 weeks before his death. The handwriting steadier than the middle entries. The steadiness of a man who has made his decisions and moved past the part that required feeling. He had written about Nora. Not extensively. Clifford had never been an extensive writer on the subject of other people's inner lives, and she had understood that for most of their marriage, even when it had hurt her. But he had written clearly and without deflection, which was more than she had expected. He wrote that he had treated her badly, not in the cataloging way of a man compiling evidence against himself, but plainly the way a person states a fact they have stopped arguing with. He wrote that the prenuptial agreement had been his idea entirely, regardless of what the documentation suggested, and that he had known at the time what it would mean if the marriage failed, and that he had proceeded anyway because he had been in those early years a man who trusted his own judgment over everything else, including the person sitting across from him at 2 in the morning building the foundation he was going to stand on. He wrote, "She was the only person who was there before there was anything to want from me. I understood that intellectually for 20 years and did almost nothing useful with the understanding." And in the last paragraph of the last entry, he had written the instructions for the silver frame on the desk, the dollar bill to be placed inside it, the precise location, and a single line: I want her to have the last laugh. I want her to be the one who decides how this ends. Nora closed the journal. She sat for a while longer, her hands resting on the cover, looking out at the lake. The afternoon light was lower now, cutting at a sharper angle through the bay window. She thought about what she wanted to do with the red folder. The FBI option was real. The evidence was sufficient. Bancroft had told her plainly that a federal prosecutor would move on what the folder contained. Prison was possible for Selena. On the attempted homicide charge, probable. She could make that happen with a phone call. She sat with the possibility fully without flinching from it, the way she had learned to sit with difficult financial realities during all those years of building Clifford's empire in the dark. She let herself feel the pull of it, the justice of it, the clean final quality that a federal indictment would have. And then she put it down. Not because Selena didn't deserve it, not because justice was an insufficient reason, but because Nora Ellsworth had spent 3 years of her life carrying Clifford Hargrove's damage, and she was not willing to carry it for one additional day beyond what she had already paid. A trial would take years. Her name would appear in every story beside his. She would be defined in every public account of the proceeding in relation to him as the first wife, as the wrong party, as a figure in his story rather than the author of her own. She had not survived 3 years of double shifts and dripping faucets and past due bills, else to become a footnote in Clifford Hargrove's criminal proceeding. She stood up, walked to the door of the library, and called down the hall. "Theodore, I'm ready." Bancroft appeared and stood into the doorway. "I'm not giving the dossier to the FBI," she said, "but I need it secured, and I need the trigger mechanism in place. And I need Selena to come here." She looked at him steadily. "Clifford left instructions about a letter." Bancroft nodded slowly. "It's already prepared. It goes out on day 14, as he specified." "Then we wait 14 days, Nora said. Outside the bay window, the heron lifted from the edge of the lake without apparent reason and rose into the gray October sky its wingspan enormous and unhurried, until it disappeared into the line of trees and was gone. The letter arrived at Selena Voss's last known address on the morning of the 14th day after the will reading exactly as Clifford had instructed. Bancroft had prepared it himself by hand using the envelope and the note card Clifford had left in the portfolio for this specific purpose. Inside, in Clifford's handwriting, written months before his death with the patience of a man who understood that timing was everything, were two things: the GPS coordinates of Hargrove Estate, and one line: "The woman you replaced is living in the house I built before I ever knew your name." Nothing else. No explanation. No invitation. No instruction about what to do with the information. Just the coordinates and the line in a dead man's handwriting arriving on the 14th day when every financial structure Selena had believed she owned was actively collapsing around her. The 14 days had not been quiet ones for Selena Voss. The foreclosure notice on the Greenwich estate had arrived on day 8. The vehicle repossession had occurred on day 10. 3 men from a licensed recovery company had taken the Bentley from the parking structure beneath her Manhattan hotel, while she was at a meeting with her attorneys, who had by that point begun to understand the full dimensions of what they were dealing with. Her personal accounts had been frozen by federal order on day 12 pending audit of transactions connected to Hargrove Capital's subsidiary accounts. Caldwell's statement from Geneva had run in the New York financial press on day 11. It was 4 sentences long. It referred to Selena Voss in the past tense and with the detached formality of a man describing a business acquaintance he had met briefly at a conference. His attorneys in Zurich had already filed preemptive documentation with the relevant federal authorities. He had left her completely with the efficiency and the total absence of sentiment of a man who had always known the exit and had simply been waiting for the correct moment to use it. When Clifford's note card arrived on day 14, Selena was living in a mid-range hotel in Midtown Manhattan on a credit card with 4 days of available balance remaining. She had 2 attorneys still willing to take her calls. She had no car, no house, and no partner. She had the coordinates in the line in a dead man's handwriting. She drove to Chester County in a rental car and on a gray afternoon that had been threatening rain since morning. The rain came in earnest somewhere on Route 30, heavy and cold, in the way of mid-October Pennsylvania rain that carries in it the full announcement of winter. Mrs. Winthrop saw the headlights on the security monitor first. She came to the library where Nora was reading and stood in the doorway. "There is a situation at the main gate. A woman. She is calling your name." Nora walked to the security monitor mounted on the wall near the fireplace. The camera feed was high definition, and the exterior lights had activated. The image was clear despite the rain. Selena Voss was standing outside the iron gates in the downpour. The transformation was total and entirely untheatrical, the simple result of 14 days of material collapse. The designer coat was soaked through, clinging and darkened by the rain. Her hair was plastered flat against her face. The mascara had run in long, dark streaks down her cheeks. She was gripping the iron bars with both hands, and her knuckles were pale with the pressure. She was 34 years old, and she looked like someone who had run out of every resource she had ever relied on. Nora looked at the image on the monitor for a moment. "Open the pedestrian gate," she said. "Let her walk up the full driveway." She went to the entrance hall, put on her coat, and stood on the stone portico beneath the overhang, out of the rain, and waited. It took Selena 11 minutes to walk the length of the white gravel driveway. Nora watched her come the entire way, the figure emerging from the dark at the gate's edge and moving up the pale corridor of gravel between the oaks, growing larger and more detailed with each step. 2 members of the estate's security staff stood behind Nora at a discreet distance. Mrs. Winthrop was inside the open front door. Selena reached the base of the stone steps and stopped. She was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the effort of holding herself together under conditions that were stripping away every available form of armor. She looked up at Nora on the portico. The rain came down between them. "You knew," Selena said. Her voice was raw and unsteady. "You sat in that office and you took that dollar, and you knew what he had done." "I knew nothing until Bancroft knocked on my door the following morning," Nora said. Her voice was calm. Clifford built everything you see here without telling me it existed. I was as surprised as you would have been. A pause. More surprised, probably. I had genuinely stopped expecting anything from him. He destroyed everything. Everything that was mine. Everything that was your God, Nora said, and something in her tone stopped Selena mid-sentence, was built on information you stole from him. The contracts Caldwell won, the money you were planning to move offshore. All of it ran on what you took out of his house while he was trusting you with it. She let that sit for a moment. Clifford built this empire twice, once with nothing and once around you quietly while you were dismantling the first version. Selena's expression moved through several things, defiance, calculation, and then something that collapsed into a more naked register. Caldwell left me. I have nothing. The accounts are frozen. The house is gone. $1 million. That's all I'm asking. Enough to leave the country and start over. It's nothing to you now. Nora reached into the pocket of her coat and removed a single sheet of paper folded twice. She came down 2 of the stone steps and held it out. Selena took it with wet fingers and unfolded it. It was a photocopy, the Aegis Consulting Chemical Analysis Report. 4 pages, technical and precise, with the compound's molecular structure. In the upper right corner of the first page, in the conclusions in plain language, at the bottom of the last, consistent with deliberate long-term cardiovascular stress induction. No therapeutic application. No legal commercial source identified. Nora watched the color leave Selena's face in stages the way light leaves a room as a cloud moves across the sun. She watched her reach the conclusion section. She watched her jaw open slightly and then close. She watched her lean against the stone pillar at the base of the steps as though her legs had made a decision her mind had not yet authorized. He knew, Nora said quietly. He knew for 4 months. He kept living in that house, having those dinners, playing those rounds of golf. He knew exactly what was happening, and he chose to say nothing because he was not finished yet. The heart attack on the Wethersfield course was not a surprise to him, Selena. He had simply decided that dying before the structure was complete was not an option he was willing to accept. Selena was staring at the paper. The original dossier photographs, communications, banking records, and this analysis is secured with Bancroft. It is sufficient for federal indictment on corporate espionage, financial fraud, and attempted homicide. Bancroft has confirmed this with 2 independent legal opinions. Nora paused. I am not going to give it to the FBI. Selena looked up sharply. Not because I forgive you, Nora said, and her voice had the quality of someone stating something they have thought through completely and arrived at with full conviction. Not because I think you don't deserve what a federal prosecutor would do with that folder, but because handing it over means I spend the next 3 years of my life as a witness in a proceeding that puts Clifford Hargrove's name in the newspaper every single day. And I have decided that I am finished paying for the choices that man made. She held Selena's gaze without flinching. I will not spend 1 more hour of my life in service of his story, not even the final chapter of it. The rain came down steadily between them. However, Nora said, she let the words stand alone. Bancroft is maintaining a complete digital copy of the dossier on an independent, encrypted server. The access protocol is automated. If you initiate any legal action relating to Clifford's estate, if you contact me or this property or any member of this staff for any reason, if you approach any media outlet about Clifford, about me, or about this estate, if you make any public claim to any asset connected to the Vanguard Trust. She paused once more. The file transmits automatically to the FBI field office in New York and to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York within 24 hours, without any further action required from me. Selena stood in this rain at the base of the steps and said nothing. The paper with the chemical analysis was shaking in her hand, though. Whether from the cold or from something else was impossible to determine. You have nothing left here, Nora said. Bife. Selena Voss stood there for a moment that had a specific, complete quality, the quality of a moment in which everything that needs to be understood has been understood, and what remains is only the mechanics of ending. She folded the paper and placed it in her soaked coat pocket. She looked up at Nora one final time, and whatever she had come here hoping to find in that look confrontation, guilt, uncertainty, she did not find it. What she found was simply Nora Ellsworth looking back at her from the portico of a house that did not exist on any map, in a good coat entirely dry, with the settled and unassailable quality of a person who has decided exactly who they are and where they stand. Selena turned and walked back down the white gravel driveway into the rain. Nora watched until the figure passed through the gate, watched the headlights of the rental car come on in the dark, sweep a wide arc, and move away down the unmarked road. Watch the red tail lights shrink and dim, and finally disappear into the rain. She stood on the portico a little while longer, listening to the rain on the gravel and the movement of the oaks in the wind. Then she turned and walked back inside. Mrs. Winthrop closed the heavy front door behind her. Nora went to the library. The fire had been lit while she was outside, the firelight moving across the spines of the books and the surface of the desk in the bay window, which now showed only darkness and rain and the faint reflection of the room itself. She went to the desk. The silver frame was there exactly where it had been since she arrived, the single-dollar bill inside it placed by a man who had been dead before she ever saw this room, positioned it with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that certain objects carry meaning beyond their material value. She opened her leather bag and removed the shoebox she had brought from Philadelphia. She lifted the lid and took out the photograph from 1998. Two young people outside the door of Hargrove Capitol Suite 304. Nora on the left with a stack of folders, Clifford on the right with a pen laughing. She set the photograph on the desk beside the silver frame. $2 bills now in the same room for the first time, one in the frame that Clifford had placed there, in preparation for a moment he would never see, and one folded in the bottom of the shoebox that she had placed there herself 2 weeks ago in the kitchen of a small apartment on Callowhill Street, after the most precisely calculated humiliation of her adult life. She looked at both of them for a longer time. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. The sound of it on the window shifted from its heavy drumming to something lighter and more irregular, the rhythm of a storm that has said what it needed to say and is now moving on. Through the bay window across the dark surface of the private lake, the first thin break appeared in the cloud cover, a narrow seam of deep blue-black sky with the cold October stars just visible through it. Nora pulled the leather chair close to the desk and sat down. She was 51 years old. She had a house that didn't exist on any map and $85 million in a trust that bore a name no one had ever heard. She had a woman driving a cheap rental car into the night with a piece of paper in her pocket, in a silence she would spend the rest of her life maintaining. She had a library full of books she hadn't read yet, in a private lake, in a staff who had been waiting patiently and without complaint for the right person to arrive and simply live here. She had a photograph from 1998 of two people she recognized but no longer was. And she had finally, for the first time in 3 years, perhaps for the first time in considerably longer than that, nothing pulling at her. No weight on her chest, no 30-second ritual between lying down and getting up, no stack of bills beside the coffee maker, no alarm set for 4:53 in the morning, nothing requiring management, nothing requiring survival. Just the fire and the rain easing and the stars appearing over the lake, and the morning coming unhurried in its own time. She looked out the window at the dark and the water and the thin cold stars. She did not think about Clifford Hargrove. She did not think about Selena Voss or Preston Caldwell or the red folder sitting in Bancroft's encrypted server. She did not review the decisions she had made or rehearse the ones still ahead. She thought about tomorrow, about what it would look like to wake up in a house this quiet without an alarm, about walking the grounds in the early morning before anyone else was up, through the formal garden and down to the edge of the lake, watching the light come across the water, the way light comes across deep water, slowly, completely, without reservation. About what it would mean to simply begin. The fire settled in the grate. The rain stopped. Nora Ellsworth sat in the library of a house that had been waiting for her in the deep and patient silence of a life that was at last entirely her own.